powdery mildew of cucurbits. Cucurbit powdery mildew, as we call it, is a very common disease. In fact, most people are very familiar with the classic symptoms. But powdery mildew typically starts as light yellow, pale spots on upper sides of leaves, or at least that's the symptom that we noticeably can identify. But very quickly, powdery colonies, the signs, actually fungal body and sporulation of the fungus will appear on both upper and lower leaves of cucurbits. Usually it's the older leaves or the more shaded leaves that are the most susceptible and will be the first to become infected. Infection is really going to ramp up at the reproductive stages of the plant. So just as plants begin to flower and fruit, that's when we typically see the most powdery mildew on cucurbits. And if left unmanaged, especially with susceptible cultivars, the plants can quickly die. So powdery mildew can very severely limit yield if it's not managed. Powdery mildew on cucurbits can be caused by one of 4 different fungi. The most common is Potospheria Xanthia, and I'll talk about these separately. Golovinomyces chicoryserum, a very common powdery mildew species, but also a couple of other powdery mildew, Golovinomyces species, can cause powdery mildew. So all 4 available here in Kentucky and able to infect cucurbits. So I'm going to start backwards. The 2 least common Golovinomyces species can be either cucurbit specific or, as the example of Aurantii, a lot of cucurbits, but also able to infect solanaceous crops or legume crops. So we see these less, but again, they are out there, and we can definitely see them as causal agents here in Kentucky. But there's a Golovinomyces species called chicoryserum that's extremely widespread, has a very wide host range, and this is the Golovinomyces species that we see the most, not just in cucurbits, but I'm seeing it in hemp. This is the one that affects lettuce, very commonly sunflower, Asteraceae host, a very wide host range, including herbaceous ornamentals, a lot of our weeds like cockabur, again the Asteraceae, chicory. We'll see a lot of Golovinomyces chicoryserum as a causal agent of cucurbit powdery mildew in Kentucky. A little bit about chicoryserum. Again, its primary host is the Asteraceae. This may be a species complex, so there may be some specificity going on. There's a lot of research ongoing right now to really lock in whether there is some specificity. So for example, will the exact fungal population jump from one species to the next within a field? Overall, though, Golovinomyces chicoryserum has an optimal range of about 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit and a humidity range from about 50 to 75% relative humidity. So we know that for a lot of powdery mildew species, they can tolerate low humidities. And in fact, 50% is a very low humidity range, but 75% not so much. So there is a wide range here when we're talking about this particular species. Golovinomyces chicoryserum prefers mature leaf tissue, so our most susceptible leaves are the more mature leaves, those that are about 6 to 8 weeks old, so 6 to 8 weeks after emergence. And this species actually produces conidia. Those are the little asexual spores. So this image is showing, see that chain of spores, but each of those conidia can blow up to about 120 miles away. So this is not one of those species that we tell you don't introduce it into your fields. In fact, it's coming, it's windblown from widespread. The other primary powdery mildew species that we see here in Kentucky is Potospheria Xanthia. So this one is not related to the other powdery mildew species, but it produces a powdery mildew disease all the same. Xanthii can infect cucurbits, legumes, a variety of herbaceous ornamentals and weeds, including back again cucurbit weeds, cockleburr, fleabane, beggarweed. So very wide host range as well. The optimal conditions for Potospheria Xanthia are fairly close to the other powdery mildew species we see, 68 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit and 50 to 90% relative humidity. So a wide range of temperatures, a wide range of humidity levels. So this pathogen, like others, can infect pretty much any time we have a susceptible plant. Anything above 90 degrees, however, usually disease is suppressed. So we don't see it in the absolute hottest conditions, but we all know that here in Kentucky, we can have many days below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, especially if some of those summer days are cloudy. We can really have conducive temperatures and conducive conditions throughout the entire growing season. In general, older leaves are the most susceptible, those that are shaded or in the inner canopies of plants, any lower leaves, and plants that are in the reproductive stages, so leaves on bearing plants. Usually after infection, symptoms start developing within 3 days, so very rapid life cycle. Like the other powdery mildew species, plant death is almost certain if we don't manage disease. Also, infection by a powdery mildew pathogen really makes plants more susceptible to other diseases like gummy stem blight. So considering that even if you're semi-managing powdery mildew, you can still predispose a plant to gummy stem blight. Other susceptible species of Potospheria Xanthia, fruit and stems, so we don't just see it on leaves, we can see it on other plant tissues as well. In general, this pathogen will overwinter in debris, and of course, all of the powdery signs that we see are both the fungal body, that mycelia, and those chains of spores that are able to blow long distances. We manage powdery mildew in general by, first of all, cultural practices. The number one recommendation is to use resistant cultivars. Looking at your seed packets and considering information from your seed supplier, there are lots of resistant cultivars out there, and I encourage every grower to take advantage of those. Any way that you can increase air circulation, so that's drying those leaves out, lowering that humidity inside that canopy, will really reduce amounts of disease. Spacing plants, again, reducing humidity and managing weeds, same, not just because weeds are also often host to these powdery mildews, but also the more weeds we see, the less air circulation and the more moisture that can be trapped inside those canopies and in those rows. We also manage powdery mildew by fungicides. We are almost definitely going to see powdery mildew in our fields, so it's very important to consider fungicides at least to some level. Hopefully not as much if we're using these cultural practices. But we're always applying fungicides preventatively, so as plants become more susceptible, it's very important that we protect them so that they do not become infected. As we are applying fungicides, we have to remember that complete coverage is critical. So we're targeting those older leaves, the leaves that are 1 to 2 months old, so we've got to be able to make good contact. Most of our fungicides are not fully systemic. If they're only partially systemic, which most of them are, they're not going to be phloem mobile. So spraying the newer parts of the plant is not going to result in translocation of fungicides to the older parts of the plant. So thorough coverage is critical even if you're using a systemic fungicide. Most of our systemic products, though, if not phloem mobile, they're at least translaminar. So that means that we can spray the top sides of leaves and we'll usually get translocation to the bottom sides of leaves. So we at least need to cover all leaf surfaces, or rather all upper leaf surfaces at the very least, if we're going to use a systemic product. And of course, don't forget, we're going to do a lot of spraying for powdery mildew, so rotating our fungicides so that we don't risk fungicide resistance within our fields. So in summary, number one, resistant cultivars. I can't stress that enough. Making sure as you plan your season, any cucurbit crop should begin with a resistant cultivar. Preventative fungicides should be considered. Whether you are organic or conventional grower, there is some level of preventative fungicide that should be considered throughout the season. And then when you are spraying, to be sure that you're thoroughly covering plants, especially as they enter those maturity phases. It's also harder to reach those older leaves, and those older leaves are what's going to be so susceptible. So it's very critical that you plan for good coverage. And as I always do, I'm reminding you to check out our Plant Pathology website. The Department of Plant Pathology at UK has a wide range of publications, from life cycle explanations and fact sheets to spray guides, cultural guides, so I highly encourage you to check us out. And that website is plantpathology.ca.uky.edu, and that's where you'll find a wealth of resources. Also, I have a social media platform. Anywhere you can look up handles KY Plant Disease, and you should find social media sites where you will come up with alerts and any new publications that we may have. Thank you.